Imagine a society with these built-in resets for debt, specific rules for freeing people, even detailed instructions on handling, like the best livestock for God. Sounds pretty structured, right? Maybe even a bit surprising.
It definitely is.
But today we're doing a deep dive into chapter 15 of Deuteronomy.
Right, and this chapter, it sits within this bigger collection of ancient laws, instructions really, that were meant to guide this community, the Israelites, as they were building a new society. And it touches on some really fundamental stuff, how people relate economically, socially, even in their religious life.
So our mission today is to really get into the nitty-gritty of Deuteronomy 15. What were these commands actually asking people to do? And what underlying principles or maybe insights can we pull out that still resonate or maybe even challenge us today? Let's dig in.
Okay, yeah, let's start where the chapter does, which is the economic side of things. There's a command right near the beginning that's pretty radical, honestly, by almost any standard, ancient or modern.
Oh, yeah.
A mandated debt cancellation.
A debt cancellation. Like, how often were they supposed to do this?
The text says it quite clearly. At the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts.
Every 7 years. Wow. That creates a real rhythm, doesn't it? A sort of forced economic reset. How is this supposed to work specifically?
Well, it specifies, every creditor shall cancel the loan he has made to his fellow Israelite. He shall not require payment from his fellow Israelite or brother. And the reason given is because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed.
Okay, so any loan between fellow Israelites,
Yeah,
just forgiven. Every 7th year.
that's the command. But there was a crucial boundary on this rule, wasn't there?
Ah, right. I remember reading that.
Absolutely. The very next verse makes this sharp distinction. You may require payment from a foreigner, but you must cancel any debt your brother owes you.
Okay, so this wasn't like a universal debt wipeout for everyone on Earth. It was specific to relationships within their own community.
Exactly, within the covenant community. It's just a different set of economic ethics applied inside versus outside.
That distinction is really key. And the reason behind it, the Lord's time for canceling debts. It's fascinating. It's not presented like, hey, we figured out this good economic policy.
No, not at all. It's presented as a divine requirement. It's totally embedded in their relationship with God and their identity as this unique community.
Right.
And following this command, well, the chapter then paints this picture of the ideal outcome, if they fully obey.
The text describes this ideal state. Wasn't it something like, there should be no poor among you? That sounds, well, utopian.
It really does. And it links obedience not just to this rule, but to all the commands, including generosity towards the poor with immense blessing and prosperity from God.
So the national prosperity.
Yeah, the text goes on, promising that if they obey, they'll lend to many nations but will borrow from none, and rule over many nations but none will rule over you. It's a picture of, national economic strength and independence tied directly to being faithful to these internal social and economic laws.
So the ideal vision tied to obedience is this society where poverty is basically eliminated through these systems of releasing care. But what happens almost immediately after that really hopeful statement?
This is where it gets really interesting and maybe a bit confusing at first. Right after painting that ideal picture of no poor, the very next verse states just flat out, there will always be poor people in the land.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
How? How do those two fit together? First, this promise of no poverty if you obey, and then, boom, the stark acknowledgement that poverty will always exist.
It seems contradictory on the surface, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But maybe the text isn't presenting an either. Perhaps the ideal of no poor is like the benchmark, the goal that perfect obedience and community solidarity could achieve.
Okay.
While the statement there will always be poor is more of a recognition of the persistent reality. Human failure, difficult circumstances, just the dynamics of a complex society maybe.
So the laws then kind of pivot to address that reality. Like, okay, since poverty will exist.
Exactly. Given that acknowledged reality, the instruction immediately follows. If there is a poor man among your brothers, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your poor brother.
Hard-hearted and tight-fisted. That language gets really specific about the attitude, doesn't it? It's not just about what you do.
It really does. It's about the internal disposition. And the positive command is just as clear. Be open-handed and freely lend him whatever he needs. It anticipates need and requires a generous response.
And then there's that incredibly insightful warning about, what was it? A specific wicked thought
Ah, yes. This is maybe one of the most psychologically revealing parts of the chapter. The warning is essentially, be careful not to harbor this wicked thought. Oh, the seventh year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you look badly on your needy brother and give him nothing.
Wow, that is remarkably direct. It totally anticipates how calculating self-interest could undermine the command for generosity, especially with that debt cancellation deadline coming up.
Right. It predicts someone thinking, why should I lend now? It's just going to get wiped out soon anyway. Better not risk the loss.
It really drills down into the spirit versus the letter of the law, doesn't it? It's not just outlining rules, it's getting into the human heart, the motivations.
Exactly. And it warns that this kind of stinginess that comes from that wicked thought, well, it can lead to the poor person appealing to God and the potential lender being found guilty of sin.
And the instruction on how to give reinforces that focus on attitude, too. Give generously to him and do so without a grudging heart.
Yeah, the giving should be willing, even cheerful, not resentful or calculated. And once again, there's a promise linked directly to this generous action. Then because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to.
So personal prosperity is actually tied to caring for the community, specifically the poor. And since, as the text established, poverty will always be present.
Right, it brings the command back one last time, almost like a summary for this section. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your brothers and toward the poor and needy in your land.
Okay, so this first section really sets up this cycle of economic release,
Yeah.
grapples with that ideal versus reality of poverty, and demands this very specific kind of open-hearted generosity. What comes next?
Well, moving from the purely financial aspects, Deuteronomy 15 also gets into rules governing social structure,
Right.
specifically regarding Hebrew servants.
Okay, let's unpack this part. What was the core rule for someone who had, say, sold themselves into servitude?
The command is pretty clear. If a fellow Hebrew, whether a man or a woman, sells themselves to you and serves for 6 years, then in the seventh year you must let him go free.
Ah, there's that 7-year cycle again. It mirrors the debt cancellation.
Yeah.
So a rhythm of social release alongside the economic one.
Exactly. And the rule didn't just end at, okay, you're free to go, did it?
Oh, it went further, right?
It did. The instruction is explicit. And when you release him, do not send him away empty-handed.
So it wasn't just about ending the servitude, it was about providing some kind of foundation for their future freedom.
Yeah.
What were masters actually required to provide?
The text specifies, supply him liberally from your flock, your threshing floor, and your wine press. These things represent the core agricultural resources, the sources of wealth back then: animals, grain, wine.
So the idea was to equip the former servant with the means to actually get back on their feet economically.
Precisely. Give them a real start. And the standard for how liberally you were supposed to supply them, well, it's tied back to that idea of divine blessing, echoing the principle we saw with giving to the poor.
Let me guess. Give to him as the Lord your God has blessed you.
You got it. Your own prosperity creates an obligation to provide generously for the person you're releasing.
And what's fascinating here is the reason given for this command, it's grounded in something specific, isn't it?
Yes. The text grounds this social rule squarely in their collective historical memory.
The memory of Egypt?
Exactly. It says point blank. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. That is why I give you this command today. Their own experience of being freed from slavery is the direct justification for requiring them to free others and provide for them.
Wow. That connection is incredibly powerful.
No.
It anchors the social ethic right into their core identity as a redeemed people. It's not just an arbitrary rule.
Not at all. But the text also addresses the possibility, what if a servant didn't want to leave?
Right, that could happen too.
It anticipates that situation. But if your servant says to you, I do not want to leave you because he loves you and your family and is well off with you.
Okay, so if the servant felt they were better off staying, what happened then?
There was a formal, very public ritual to mark their voluntary decision to stay permanently. The master was to take an awl and push it through his earlobe into the door, and he will become your servant for life. And it notes, do the same for your maidservant.
And all through the ear into the doorpost. That's vivid. It signifies a permanent attachment to that household, chosen by the servant.
Right, it's a visible, lasting mark of a chosen, lifelong bond, contrasting sharply with the default expectation of freedom after 6 years.
So freedom with provision was the standard, but permanent service was possible if, and only if, it was initiated voluntarily by the servant. And didn't the text also give a command about the master's attitude towards the release itself?
Yes, another warning against resentment, actually. Do not consider it a hardship to set your servant free.
And the reasoning provided there is quite practical, isn't it?
Very practical. It says it's because his service to you these 6 years has been worth twice as much as that of a hired hand.
Ah, so the implication is you've already gotten incredible value from this person's stable, dedicated labor over 6 years, much more than you would have from just hiring temporary workers.
Exactly. It reframes the release not as a loss for the master, but as the deserved culmination of genuinely valuable service. And just like with generosity towards the poor, this section wraps up with that familiar promise.
Let me guess. Blessing.
You know it. And the Lord your God will bless you in everything you do. Social justice, treating servants properly, it's all linked again to divine favor.
Okay, so we've got economic release with debt cancellation, social release with freeing servants, both tied to this 7-year cycle and promises of blessing. But the chapter pivots again in the final section, right? Moving away from the economic and social.
Yes, the focus shifts entirely in the last part, moving into the realm of religious practice, specifically rules about the firstborn of animals and the standards for sacrifice.
Right, the command to set apart for the Lord your God every firstborn male of your herds and flocks. This was a pretty fundamental principle, wasn't it? Dedicating the first and presumably the best to God.
It absolutely was. And chapter 15 gets specific about what you absolutely must not do with these animals once they're consecrated, set apart for God.
You weren't supposed to use them for regular farm work or anything like that.
Correct. Do not put the firstborn of your oxen to work, and do not shear the firstborn of your sheep. They're sacred, set apart, their purpose is different.
So instead of labor, what was their intended use?
Their main purpose was for communal worship and actually feasting. The instruction is, each year you and your family are to eat them in the presence of the Lord your God at the place he will choose.
Interesting. So it wasn't just a sacrifice burned up on an altar necessarily, but a shared meal, acknowledging God's provision together and in a specific designated location.
Exactly. But then comes a really crucial distinction. What about animals that weren't? Well, perfect. What if a firstborn animal had some kind of defect?
Ah, right. Like if it was lame or blind.
Precisely. The text is very clear. If an animal has a defect, is lame or blind, or has any serious flaw, you must not sacrifice it to the Lord your God. Flawed animals were simply not acceptable as offerings in that sacred context.
Okay, so you couldn't use it for that special meal before the Lord at the chosen place. What were you supposed to do with a firstborn animal that was deemed defective, unfit for sacrifice?
Well, you weren't supposed to just waste it, but its status changed completely. You are to eat it in your own towns. Basically, it became common meat, something you could eat locally at home.
And this next part is particularly interesting, especially regarding, like, ritual purity rules. It says, both the ceremonially unclean and the clean may eat it.
Yeah, that's a really significant detail. Normally, eating sacrificial meals required the participants to be ritually pure, but a firstborn animal that was defective and therefore disqualified from being a sacrifice, it lost that sacred status entirely.
So anyone could eat it, regardless of their ritual state.
Yes, it says eat it as if it were gazelle or deer.
So it went from potentially being the most sacred type of animal the firstborn set apart for God to being treated just like any wild game you might hunt for food, completely outside the usual ritual purity rules simply because it had a physical flaw.
Exactly. Its defect fundamentally shifted its status from sacred offering back to common sustenance. But even then, there was still one consistent rule that applied regarding the blood.
And let me guess. Don't eat the blood.
You got it. But you must not eat the blood. Pour it out on the ground like water. That command about the blood remains consistent throughout these laws, underscoring its unique significance.
So when you look at the whole chapter, it really weaves together these seemingly disparate areas. Economics, social structure, religious practice.
It really does. They aren't presented in isolation at all, but as interconnected parts of this unified vision for what a just and faithful community should look like.
It's true. You've got the economic rhythm of canceling debts, the social requirement of releasing servants, and that's explicitly tied to their own history of redemption, which is powerful. And then these very specific rules about handling the most sacred animals and sacrifices, including this clear distinction about what makes something acceptable or renders it common.
And if you pull back and look at the bigger picture, you see that consistent thread running through it all.
Wow.
obedience to these diverse commands, whether you're dealing with money or people or dedicated animals, it's repeatedly linked to that promise of God's blessing and prosperity.
both for the individual and for the nation as a whole.
Exactly. It suggests this really holistic understanding where faithfulness or lack thereof impacts every single area of life.
So pulling back now from our deep dive into Deuteronomy chapter 15, we've explored this system with these built-in resets for debt and servitude. We've looked at detailed instructions on dealing with poverty that fascinatingly acknowledge its persistent reality while still commanding this radical generosity. And then these specific rules about how sacred offerings are treated, including that notable exclusion of the flawed from the sacred space.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? What parallels or maybe contrasts do these ancient rules strike for you when you think about our own modern approaches to debt? Economic inequality, labor relations, even how we value things, how we handle what we deem most important or, set apart in our world today.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider. This chapter commands not just debt cancellation and the generous release of servants with provision, but it also insists on, quote, perfect animals for sacrifice, while basically relegating the flawed firstborn to common status. So when you put these instructions side by side, this financial release, this social generosity rooted in historical liberation, and then this requirement for a worthy religious offering contrasted with the unworthy being made common. What does this ancient text suggest about the deep importance of release, generosity, and maybe what truly constitutes a worthy offering versus a flawed one? Perhaps not just in some ancient ritual sense, but in how we live and what we value in our daily lives today. Definitely something to ponder.